On Christmas night, I was locked outside in 35 degrees, with no blanket. My daughter-in-law screamed, "This old woman is such a pain! Nobody can stand her anymore." Inside by the fireplace, everyone laughed. That's when my millionaire grandson saw me, kicked the door and said 3 words. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clarice, and I'm 70 years old. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am, because sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. It was Christmas Eve, 2023. The snow was falling heavily outside, and the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees. I remember checking the weather on my old phone before leaving my small apartment, wondering if I should bring a heavier coat. I decided against it. After all, I was just going to my son Michael's house for dinner. I'd be inside, warm, surrounded by family. At least, that's what I thought. I had been looking forward to this night for weeks. Michael had called me 3 weeks earlier, his voice unusually warm over the phone. "Mom, Sarah and I want you to come for Christmas dinner this year. It's been too long." I felt my heart lift in a way it hadn't in years. My son, my only child, wanted me there. After months of short phone calls and excuses about being too busy, he was finally reaching out. I spent days preparing. I bought gifts for everyone, even though my Social Security check barely covered my expenses. I found a beautiful scarf for Sarah, hoping it might help bridge the gap between us. For Michael, I got a photo album filled with pictures from his childhood, thinking he might enjoy the memories. I even bought a bottle of expensive wine, splurging on something I couldn't really afford. The drive to their house in the suburbs took longer than usual because of the weather. My old Honda struggled through the snow, but I was determined to make it. As I pulled into their driveway, I could see the warm glow of lights through the windows. The house looked perfect, like something from a Christmas card. I could hear laughter coming from inside, the sound of people enjoying themselves. I gathered my gifts and walked carefully up the icy walkway to the front door. Through the window, I could see my son Michael sitting by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand. Sarah was beside him, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing what looked like an expensive red dress. There were other people there too, faces I didn't recognize, but they all looked happy and warm. I knocked on the door, my heart beating with anticipation. I heard footsteps approaching, and then the door opened just a crack. Sarah's face appeared, but her expression wasn't welcoming. It was cold, almost annoyed. "Clarice," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "What are you doing here?" I felt confused. "Michael invited me for dinner. Christmas dinner. We talked about it 3 weeks ago." She looked back into the house, then stepped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind her. The cold air hit me immediately, and I realized how thin my coat really was. "Look," Sarah said, her voice low but sharp. "Tonight isn't a good night. We have important guests here, Michael's business partners and their families. It's not really appropriate for you to be here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "But Michael invited me. He specifically asked me to come." "Michael says a lot of things," Sarah replied, her eyes hard. "He feels sorry for you, but that doesn't mean you should just show up and expect to be included in everything." Behind her, I could hear the warm chatter continuing, the clink of glasses, the sound of people enjoying their Christmas Eve. My son's voice rose above the others, telling some story that made everyone laugh. He hadn't even come to the door to see me. "I brought gifts," I said quietly, holding up the bag in my hands. "I've been looking forward to this for weeks." Sarah glanced at the bag with something that looked like disgust. "Just leave them on the porch. I'll make sure everyone gets them later." That's when I heard it, a voice from inside the house, loud enough to carry through the slightly open door. It was Sarah's voice, but she was talking to the people inside, not to me. "God, that old woman is such a pain in the ass," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "She just shows up whenever she wants, expecting us to drop everything for her. Nobody can stand her anymore. But Michael's too nice to just tell her to stay away." The laughter that followed was like ice in my veins. My son's laugh was among them. Michael, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 8. The boy I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college. The boy I'd given everything to. I stood there on that porch, the snow starting to soak through my thin coat, listening to my daughter-in-law mock me while my own son laughed along. The temperature was dropping, but the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. "Did you hear that?" I asked Sarah when she turned back to me. She didn't look embarrassed or apologetic. If anything, she looked satisfied. "Hear what?" "What you just said, about me being a pain, about nobody being able to stand me." Sarah shrugged. "I was just being honest. Look, Clarice, you're getting older, and sometimes older people don't realize when they're being difficult. Maybe it's time you started spending holidays at the senior center or something. There are programs for people in your situation. My situation. As if being 70 and alone was some kind of disease. I felt something breaking inside me. Not just my heart, but something deeper. The last thread of hope I'd been holding on to, that my son still loved me, that I still had a family. "I raised that boy alone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I gave him everything. And he's grateful," Sarah said, her tone dismissive. "But gratitude doesn't mean he has to sacrifice his social life for you. These people tonight, they're important. They matter for his career." I looked past her through the window again. Michael was still by the fire, still laughing, still enjoying his evening. He hadn't even asked where Sarah had gone or who was at the door. His own mother was standing in the freezing cold, and he couldn't be bothered to check on the situation. "I'll go," I said finally. "Good," Sarah replied, already turning back toward the door. "And Clarice? Next time, maybe call first. You can't just assume you're welcome." The door closed with a soft click, and I was alone on the porch. The porch of the house where my son lived, the house I'd helped him buy by giving him the down payment from my retirement savings. I stood there for a moment, the snow falling heavier now, trying to process what had just happened. Through the window, I could see Sarah returning to the group by the fireplace. She said something that made everyone laugh again, and Michael put his arm around her, pulling her close. They looked like the perfect couple, surrounded by their perfect friends, in their perfect house. I turned and walked back to my car, my feet slipping on the ice. The gifts were still in my hands, but they felt heavier now, like they were weighted with all my foolish hopes. I set them by the front door as Sarah had suggested, then made my way back down the treacherous walkway. As I reached my car, I looked back one more time. The house glowed warmly against the dark winter sky, full of light and laughter and celebration. Inside, my son was having the time of his life, surrounded by people who mattered to him. People who weren't me. I sat in my cold car for a long time before starting the engine, my hands shaking from more than just the cold. 35 degrees, and I'd been shut out in the cold by my own family, by the son I'd devoted my entire life to. But as I sat there, something else was building inside me. Not just hurt, but a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Because while Sarah thought she had won, while she thought she had successfully pushed the troublesome old woman out of their lives, she had no idea what she had actually done. She had no idea that in 3 days, someone was going to show up at that same front door. Someone who would change everything. Someone who had been looking for me for months, and who was about to discover exactly how his stepmother had been treating the grandmother he'd never been allowed to meet. The drive home from Michael's house that Christmas Eve was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every red light felt like an eternity to sit with my thoughts, every turn a reminder that I was driving away from the only family I had left. By the time I reached my small apartment, the snow had piled up on my windshield wipers, and my hands were so cold I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment complex, staring up at the dark window of my unit on the second floor. Mrs. Peterson's apartment next door had Christmas lights twinkling in her window, and I could see the blue glow of her television through the thin curtains. At least someone was having a peaceful Christmas Eve. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway smelled like pine sol and the lingering aroma of someone's Christmas cookies. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers still numb from the cold, and finally got the door open. My apartment felt impossibly quiet after the warmth and laughter I'd heard through Michael's window. I turned on the small lamp by my chair and looked around at my modest living space. The tiny Christmas tree I'd bought at the grocery store sat in the corner, decorated with ornaments I'd collected over 40 years of Christmases. Most of them were handmade things Michael had given me when he was little. Popsicle stick angels, paper snowflakes, a clay handprint from when he was 6 years old. I sank into my recliner and closed my eyes, but all I could see was Sarah's cold face, hear her dismissive voice. Nobody can stand her anymore. The words played over and over in my head like a broken record. But as I sat there in the quiet, my mind began to drift back to when things were different, back to when Michael needed me, when I was the most important person in his world, back to when being his mother was enough. Michael was born on a rainy Tuesday in April 1982. His father, Jim, held him first, this tiny, red-faced baby with the strongest lungs in the maternity ward. Jim looked at me over our son's head and said, "Clarice, we made something perfect." I remember thinking that nothing in my life would ever be as important as taking care of this little person. For the first 8 years of Michael's life, we were a complete family. Jim worked at the auto plant, and I worked part-time at the elementary school so I could be home when Michael got off the school bus. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Jim would come home from work covered in grease and motor oil, and Michael would run to him like he was a hero returning from war. Then, Jim had the heart attack. 42 years old, no warning signs, just collapsed in the parking lot after his shift. By the time the paramedics got him to the hospital, it was too late. Michael was 8 years old, and suddenly it was just the two of us. I remember the night after the funeral. Michael crawled into bed with me, his little body shaking with sobs. "Is Daddy coming back, Mommy?" he asked, and I had to tell him no, that it was just going to be us now, but that we were going to be okay. I promised him we were going to be okay. Keeping that promise nearly killed me. Jim's life insurance policy barely covered the funeral expenses. The mortgage on our house, the car payment, the regular bills, it all fell on me. The part-time job at the school wasn't nearly enough. I took a second job working nights at a diner, serving coffee and pie to truck drivers and insomniacs. Mrs. Rodriguez next door watched Michael for me, bless her heart, but I hated leaving him. When Michael was 10, I took a third job cleaning offices on weekends. I would drop him off at my sister's house Saturday morning and pick him up Sunday evening, exhausted and smelling like industrial cleaning supplies. Michael would be quiet on the drive home, and I could tell he was angry that I was gone so much. But what choice did I have? The worst part was the school events I missed. The Christmas concerts where Michael would scan the audience looking for me, his face falling when he couldn't find me because I was working the dinner shift at the diner. The parent-teacher conferences I had to reschedule because they conflicted with my office cleaning schedule. The field trips I couldn't chaperone because I couldn't afford to take time off work. I watched other mothers dropping their kids off at school in the morning, dressed in nice clothes, carrying coffee cups, probably heading home to peaceful houses with time to shower and relax before picking their children up in the afternoon. I envied them so much it made my chest ache, but I kept telling myself it was temporary, that once Michael was older, once I could find a better job, things would get easier. I just had to keep us afloat until then. When Michael turned 13, I finally got a better position at the county clerk's office. Regular hours, benefits, enough money to quit the diner job. But by then, something had changed between us. Michael had learned to be independent, maybe too independent. He made his own breakfast, did his own laundry, handled his homework without my help. He was polite to me but distant, like I was a roommate rather than his mother. "I'm fine, Mom," became his standard response to everything. "How was school?" "Fine." "How was the basketball game?" "Fine." "Do you want to talk about anything?" "I'm fine." I told myself it was normal teenage behavior, that all kids pulled away from their parents at that age. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew that all those nights I'd been gone, all those events I'd missed, all those times he'd needed me and I hadn't been there, it had built a wall between us, brick by brick. Still, I was proud of him. He was a good student, stayed out of trouble, had nice friends. When he graduated high school, I cried harder than he did, not just from pride, but from relief. We'd made it. Despite everything, I'd raised a good son. College was another struggle. Michael got into a decent state school, but even with financial aid, it was expensive. I took out a second mortgage on the house to help cover his expenses. I told him it was no problem, that his education was the most important thing. What I didn't tell him was that I was eating cereal for dinner most nights to save money, or that I'd started shopping at thrift stores, or that I hadn't bought myself new clothes in 2 years. Michael called home once a week during his freshman year, but the calls got shorter and less frequent as time went on. He was busy with classes, with friends, with a life that didn't include me. I understood that, or at least I tried to. College was supposed to open up the world for him. I just wished that world still had a place for his mother. When he graduated, I used the last of my savings to buy a plane ticket to attend the ceremony. I sat in the bleachers with hundreds of other proud parents, watching him walk across that stage in his cap and gown. He looked so handsome, so confident, so grown up. When they called his name, I cheered louder than anyone else there. After the ceremony, Michael found me in the crowd. He gave me a hug and said, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." For just a moment, it felt like we were close again, like all the sacrifices had been worth it. Then he told me he'd gotten a job in another state, a good job, with opportunities for advancement. He'd be leaving in 2 weeks. I smiled and told him how proud I was, how excited I was for him. I didn't tell him that I'd been hoping he might move back home for a while, that I'd been looking forward to having him close again. I didn't tell him that the house felt too big and too quiet with just me in it, or that I'd been talking to his picture on the mantelpiece some evenings because I missed conversation. Michael called less frequently after he moved away. Every few months, maybe. The conversations were pleasant but brief. He was doing well at work, had made some friends, was thinking about buying a condo. He sounded happy, which was what mattered. Then, 3 years ago, he called with big news. He was getting married. Her name was Sarah, and she was wonderful. And they were having the wedding in her hometown because her family was paying for most of it. He hoped I could make it, but he understood if the travel was too expensive. I used my entire tax refund to buy a plane ticket and a dress for the wedding. Sarah was beautiful, I had to admit. Blonde, sophisticated, well-educated. She came from money, I could tell immediately. Her family's house was the kind of place I'd only seen in magazines. At the wedding reception, I sat at a table with some of Michael's college friends who were polite, but clearly saw me as an obligation. Sarah's family barely acknowledged me. When people asked how I knew the groom, I said proudly, "I'm his mother," but I could see in their faces that I didn't look like what they expected. I was wearing a dress from Walmart and shoes that were comfortable rather than fashionable. I didn't fit into their world. Sarah was polite to me that day, but even then I could sense her discomfort. When Michael introduced us, she smiled and said all the right things, but her eyes were calculating, measuring. I could see her taking inventory of my clothes, my accent, my mannerisms, and finding them all lacking. After they moved in together, Michael's calls became even less frequent. When I did hear from him, Sarah was always there, and I could tell she was listening to every word. The conversations became stilted, careful. Michael stopped mentioning visits home, stopped asking about my health or my life. Last year, when I had pneumonia and was in the hospital for a week, I called to tell him. Sarah answered the phone and said Michael was at an important business dinner, but she'd give him the message. He never called back. When I finally reached him 3 days later, he seemed surprised. "Sarah didn't tell me you were sick, Mom. She said you'd called, but that it wasn't urgent." That should have been my first clue about who I was dealing with, but I made excuses for her. Told myself she was just protective of Michael's time. I didn't want to believe that my son had married someone who saw me as a threat to be neutralized. Sitting in my quiet apartment that Christmas Eve, still cold from standing on their porch, I finally let myself see the truth I'd been avoiding for years. Sarah hadn't just married my son. She'd systematically worked to erase me from his life, and Michael had let her do it. All those years of sacrifice, of working myself to exhaustion, of putting his needs before my own, it had led to this moment, to standing in the cold while my son laughed at jokes about what a burden I was. But as I sat there in my chair, looking at the Christmas ornaments Michael had made with his little hands all those years ago, I realized something else. I might have been a fool to give everything for someone who no longer wanted it, but I wasn't the only fool in this story. Because tomorrow, someone was going to knock on Michael and Sarah's door. Someone who was going to turn their perfect little world upside down. Someone who had no idea what kind of woman his stepmother really was. The days after Christmas passed in a gray blur. I went through the motions of my routine. Grocery shopping, paying bills, watching the news, but everything felt hollow. I kept replaying that night over and over, wondering if I should have fought harder, should have demanded to see my son. But every time I thought about Sarah's cold face and the sound of that laughter, I felt the fight drain out of me all over again. It was December 28th when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize the number. And at my age, unknown calls usually mean someone trying to sell me something I can't afford. But something made me pick up. "Hello, is this Clarice Henderson?" The voice was young, male, polite but uncertain. "Yes, this is Clarice. Who's calling, please?" "My name is David Morrison. I think you might be my grandmother." I nearly dropped the phone. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "My grandmother. My biological grandmother. I've been looking for you for almost 2 years." I sank into my kitchen chair, my heart pounding. "I don't understand. Who are your parents?" "My mother is Sarah Morrison. Well, Sarah Henderson now. She married your son Michael about 3 years ago, but she's been married before. I'm her son from her first marriage." The room seemed to spin around me. Sarah had a son she'd never mentioned. Not once in the 3 years since she'd married Michael. A grandson I never knew existed. "How old are you?" I managed to ask. "I'm 25. I live in Seattle, work in tech. Mom told me." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "Mom told me that Michael's family was complicated, that his mother was difficult and unstable, and that it was better if we didn't have contact. She said you had problems with alcohol and that you'd been inappropriate with me when I was younger, which is why they had to cut ties." I felt sick. Sarah had poisoned this young man against me before I'd even had a chance to meet him. "None of that is true," I said quietly. "I've never met you. I didn't even know you existed until this phone call." "I know that now," David said, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. "That's why I'm calling. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago to find you because something never felt right about Mom's story. The investigator couldn't find any records of you having alcohol problems or any police reports or anything that would support what she told me. And when I confronted her about it last week, she finally admitted she'd been lying." I gripped the phone tighter. "What exactly did she tell you?" David was quiet for a moment. "She said that when she married Michael, she was worried that having a grown son from a previous marriage would complicate things. She wanted to start fresh, build a new family with Michael, and she felt like you and I would be complications. So she told Michael that I was better off staying out of the picture because of some custody issues with my biological father, which was also a lie. And she told me that you were dangerous and that Michael supported keeping us apart. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Sarah had systematically removed both David and me from Michael's life, isolating him from family he didn't even know he had. She'd built her perfect little world by erasing the people who might complicate it. "Where are you now?" I asked. "I'm actually here in town. I flew in yesterday. I was planning to drive over to Mom and Michael's house today to confront them both, but I wanted to talk to you first. I wanted to hear your side of things." "David," I said, my voice shaking, "I would very much like to meet you, but I need you to know something first. Your mother and we don't get along. She's made it very clear that I'm not welcome in their lives. Just 3 days ago, she wouldn't even let me into their house for Christmas dinner." "What do you mean she wouldn't let you in?" So I told him. I told him about the phone call from Michael, about driving through the snow to get there, about standing on that porch in the cold while Sarah told me I wasn't wanted. I told him about the cruel things she'd said, about the laughter I'd heard through the door, about how my son had let it all happen without even coming to see what was going on. David was quiet while I talked, but I could hear his breathing getting heavier, more agitated. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Jesus Christ," he finally said. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was that bad. It's not your fault, sweetheart. You didn't know. But I should have. I should have tried harder to find you sooner. I let her convince me for too long that staying away was the right thing to do. You were protecting yourself. That's what children do when adults lie to them, even grown children." "I want to meet you," David said firmly. "Today, right now, if you're willing. And then I want to go to their house together. I want them to see that their lies didn't work." An hour later, I heard a car door slam in my parking lot. I looked out my window and saw a tall young man getting out of a rental car, looking around at the apartment complex like he was trying to find the right building. I waved from my window, and he looked up and smiled. Even from that distance, I could see he had Michael's eyes. When I opened my apartment door, David was standing there holding a bouquet of flowers and looking nervous. He was handsome in a quiet way, with dark hair and those familiar brown eyes. He was dressed casually but nicely, jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, but his smile was warm and genuine. "Hi, Grandma," he said, and I started crying right there in my doorway. "Oh, honey," I said, reaching for him. "Come here." He hugged me, and I was struck by how tall he was, how solid. This was my grandson, this lovely young man I'd been robbed of knowing for 25 years. "I can't believe this," I said, wiping my eyes as I led him into my apartment. "I can't believe I have a grandson." David looked around my small living space, taking in the modest furniture, the tiny Christmas tree, the photos of Michael covering nearly every surface. His expression was sad, but not pitying. "Tell me about yourself," I said, gesturing for him to sit on my little couch. "What do you do in Seattle? Are you married? What do you like to do?" David laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's exactly what a grandmother should ask. Mom always said you wouldn't care about those things, that you were too selfish and self-centered to be interested in family. That's not true. I want to know everything." So he told me. He worked for a software company developing security systems. He'd graduated from the University of Washington with a computer science degree. He wasn't married, but had been dating someone seriously for 2 years. He liked hiking, cooking, and reading mystery novels. He owned a condo in Capitol Hill and a dog named Murphy. "I always felt like something was missing," he said. "Mom remarried when I was 15, and don't get me wrong, Michael seems like a decent guy. But I always wondered about having grandparents, having extended family. Mom would get weird whenever I asked about it, change the subject, or get angry. She said her parents were dead and that Michael's family was too problematic to deal with." "What about your biological father's family?" "Dad died when I was 12. Car accident. His parents had died when he was young, so it really was just Mom and me for a while. That's why I was so excited when she married Michael. I thought maybe I'd finally have a bigger family. But Sarah made sure that didn't happen." "Yeah. And the crazy thing is, I make good money, really good money. I could have been helping you, spending time with you, being part of your life. Instead, I've been living in Seattle thinking my grandmother was some kind of unstable person who didn't want anything to do with me." I reached over and took his hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." David squeezed my hand and looked around the apartment again. "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Are you okay financially? I mean, this place is nice, but it's pretty small, and I know Social Security doesn't pay much." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm fine. I get by." "That's not what I asked. Are you comfortable? Do you have everything you need?" I looked at this young man, this stranger who was my family, who was showing me more concern in one afternoon than my son had in years. "I'm careful with money. I don't need much." David's jaw tightened. "Do you know that Michael and Sarah live in a house worth $500,000? Do you know that Michael drives a BMW and Sarah drives a Mercedes? Do you know they just got back from a 2-week vacation in Europe?" I didn't know those things, though I wasn't entirely surprised. Michael had always been ambitious, and Sarah clearly came from money. "The thing is," David continued, "I've been successful. I've been lucky and worked hard, and I'm doing really well for myself. For years, I've been sending Mom money for things, helping with expenses, paying for those vacations. I thought I was helping my family. But now I'm wondering if any of that money ever made its way to you. David, you don't need to worry about that." "But I do. You're my grandmother. You should be comfortable. You should be secure. And instead, you're living in a 1-bedroom apartment, worrying about bills, while my mother is living in luxury with money that could have been helping you." I didn't know what to say to that. The idea that there might have been help available all along, that Sarah had deliberately kept David's support away from me, was almost too painful to process. "Are you ready to go over there?" David asked, standing up. "Because I have some things I need to say to them, and I want them to see that their lies didn't work." I want them to see that you and I found each other despite everything they did to prevent it. I looked at my grandson, this confident young man who'd been stolen from me for 25 years, who was now ready to fight for me in a way my own son never had. Yes, I said, I'm ready. But as we drove toward Michael and Sarah's house, I couldn't help wondering what we were walking into. Because people like Sarah don't give up their power easily, and Michael had already shown me which side he was on. I was terrified that even with David beside me, I was about to be hurt all over again. I had no idea that what was waiting for us at that house was going to change everything. The drive to Michael's house felt both too long and too short. David drove confidently through the suburban streets, but I could see his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as we got closer. I sat in the passenger seat, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Are you sure about this? I asked as we turned onto Michael's street. Maybe we should call first. No, David said firmly. I want to see their faces when they realize what they've done. I want them to have to explain themselves without having time to prepare their excuses. As we pulled into the driveway, I could see Michael's BMW in the garage and Sarah's white Mercedes parked beside it. They were both home. Through the living room window, I could see the aftermath of their Christmas celebration. Fancy wine glasses still on the coffee table, expensive-looking floral arrangements on the mantel. The house looked even more impressive in daylight, with its perfect landscaping and pristine paint job. Nice house, David said, but his tone was bitter. Built with my money, apparently. We walked up to the front door together, and I felt a strange sense of déjà vu from just 4 days earlier. But this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had someone on my side. David rang the doorbell, and we waited. I could hear footsteps approaching, and then the door opened. It was Michael, wearing a casual sweater and looking relaxed, like he'd been having a peaceful afternoon. When he saw me, his expression immediately became guarded, but when his eyes shifted to David, he looked confused. Mom, Michael said carefully, what are you doing here? And who is this? Before I could answer, Sarah appeared behind Michael, and the moment she saw David, her face went completely white. She grabbed Michael's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sweater. David, she breathed, and I could hear the panic in her voice. What are you doing here? Hello, Mom, David said, his voice cold as ice. I thought it was time I met my step-grandmother. You know, the one you told me was dead. Michael looked confused, his eyes darting between David and Sarah. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Sarah, who is this? This is my son, Sarah said quietly, not taking her eyes off David. My son from my first marriage. The look of shock on Michael's face was almost comical. Your son? You told me you didn't have any children. I told you it was complicated, Sarah said, her voice shaking, that he was better off with his father's family. His father is dead, David said bluntly, has been for 13 years, and there is no father's family. There's never been anyone but you and me. And then Michael when you married him. Except you decided I didn't fit into your new perfect life. I watched Michael's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. His wife had been lying to him for 3 years about having a son. A grown son who was standing on their doorstep, clearly angry and hurt. Can we come in? David asked, though it wasn't really a request. We have some things to discuss. Sarah looked like she wanted to refuse, but Michael stepped aside, still looking stunned. We walked into their beautiful living room, and I couldn't help but notice how different it felt from the inside. Everything was expensive and perfectly arranged, but it felt cold, like a showroom rather than a home. Sit down, Mom, David said to Sarah, and his tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch like she was ready to flee at any moment. Michael remained standing, running his hands through his hair. I don't understand any of this, Michael said. Sarah, why didn't you tell me you had a son? Why did you lie about it? Sarah looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes, because I knew this would happen. I knew she would try to turn you against me, try to make problems in our marriage. She didn't even know I existed until today, David said, because you told me she was dangerous and unstable, and you told Michael I was better off staying away. You isolated both of us so you could have your perfect little family without any complications. Michael looked at me, then back at David. Is this true? Sarah, is this true? I was protecting our relationship, Sarah said, her voice getting higher and more defensive. David has always been difficult, always causing drama. And your mother, Michael, she's needy and demanding. I just wanted us to have a chance to build something together, without all the baggage. Baggage? David's voice was dangerous now. Is that what you call family? Is that what you call the people who love us? You don't understand, Sarah said, turning to Michael with pleading eyes. I've been supporting David for years, sending him money, helping with his expenses, but he's never satisfied, always wanting more. And your mother, she's constantly calling, always needing something. I was just trying to protect you from all of that stress. I felt like I'd been slapped. Sarah, you've never given me a penny. And I barely call Michael at all anymore because you made it clear I wasn't welcome. That's not true, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Actually, let's talk about money, Mom. Let's talk about the $50,000 I've given you over the past 3 years. The money I thought was helping our family, helping with expenses. Maybe helping my new step-grandmother if she needed anything. Michael's eyes widened. $50,000? Sarah, what is he talking about? Sarah's face was getting redder by the minute. David is exaggerating. It wasn't that much. David pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what looked like bank records. Let's see. December 2023, $5,000 for Christmas expenses. October 2023, $3,000 for home repairs. August 2023, $4,000 for medical bills. Should I keep going, Mom? Those were legitimate expenses, Sarah said desperately. What medical bills? Michael asked sharply. We have excellent insurance. What home repairs cost $4,000 that I don't know about? David looked at me, then back at Sarah. Here's what I think happened, Mom. I think you've been taking my money and using it to fund your lifestyle with Michael. The vacations, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes. And you've been telling me it was for family expenses while you were actively working to keep me away from the family. And while you were living in luxury with David's money, I said quietly. You were telling everyone what a burden I was. You were making sure I spent Christmas Eve alone in the cold while you laughed about me with your friends. Michael turned to look at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something like shame in his eyes. Mom, what are you talking about? So I told him. I told him about Christmas Eve, about standing on his porch in 35-degree weather while Sarah told me I wasn't welcome. I told him about hearing her call me a pain in the ass, about hearing him laugh along with the cruel jokes. I told him how it felt to drive home alone on Christmas Eve, knowing that my son had chosen his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. When I finished, the room was completely silent. Michael was staring at Sarah with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror and disgust. You left my mother outside in the cold on Christmas Eve, he said slowly. She just showed up, Sarah said weakly. We had important guests. It wasn't appropriate. Important guests? Michael's voice was rising. More important than my mother? You said yourself she was becoming a problem, Sarah shot back. You said you were tired of dealing with her constant neediness. I never said that, Michael said. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could tell that maybe, in some private moments, he had said exactly that. David stood up, and I could see that his patience was completely gone. You know what? This is all very touching, but I think we're missing the point here. The point is that you, Mom, are a liar and a manipulator. You lied to me about having a step-grandmother. You lied to Michael about having a son. You took my money under false pretenses. And you treated an elderly woman like garbage on Christmas Eve while living off money I sent to help the family. He walked over to where Sarah was sitting and looked down at her. But the thing that really gets to me, the thing I can't forgive, is that you robbed me of 25 years with my grandmother. 25 years of birthdays and holidays and conversations and memories. You stole that from both of us because it didn't fit into your perfect little fantasy. Sarah was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and anger at being caught. You don't understand the pressure I was under. I was trying to make this marriage work, trying to blend our lives together. Having complications would have ruined everything. Complications? I said, standing up as well. Is that what you call love? Is that what you call family? That's when something in David snapped. He walked over to the front door and, to my complete shock, kicked it open so hard that it banged against the wall. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. "David!" Sarah screamed. "What are you doing?" David turned around, his face filled with a cold fury I hadn't seen before. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone in the room go silent. "I'm done with the lies, done with the manipulation, done with watching you hurt people I care about." He looked directly at Sarah, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but filled with such intensity that it made the hair on my arms stand up. "You're finished, Mom." The 3 words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah's face went from red to white in an instant, and I could see in her eyes that she knew somehow that everything was about to change, that whatever power she'd held over this family, whatever control she'd maintained through lies and manipulation, was about to disappear. Michael was staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he was seeing was making him sick. "Sarah," he said slowly, "what else have you lied about?" But before Sarah could answer, David pulled out his phone again. "Actually, Michael, there's something else you should know. Something I found out when I hired that private investigator." He looked at Sarah, and his smile was cold as winter. "Should I tell him, Mom, or do you want to?" The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah was pressed back against the couch cushions like she was trying to disappear into them. Michael stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. David held his phone like it was a weapon, and in a way, I suppose it was. "What are you talking about?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David looked at me, then back at his stepfather. "I hired a private investigator to find information about both sides of my family. What I discovered about Grandma Clarice was that everything Mom told me was a lie, but I also discovered some interesting things about Mom's finances." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. "David, don't do this." "Do what, Mom? Tell the truth? Isn't it about time someone in this family started telling the truth?" Michael moved closer to David, his voice urgent. "What did you find out?" David scrolled through his phone, his expression grim. "Did you know that your wife has been married 4 times, Michael? Not once, like she told you, 4 times. I felt my knees go weak. 4 marriages? Sarah had told Michael she'd only been married once before, to David's father. "That's impossible," Michael said, shaking his head. "Sarah told me about David's father. She said he was her first husband, that he died in a car accident." "Oh, David's father did die in a car accident," David said. "But he was husband number 3, not number 1. Husband number 1 was when she was 19, lasted 8 months. Husband number 2 lasted 2 years, ended when she cleaned out his bank account, and disappeared. My father was number 3, and there was a 4th husband between my father's death and meeting you." Sarah was openly sobbing now, but David didn't stop. Each marriage followed the same pattern. She'd find a man with money or potential, charm him into marrying her quickly, gain access to his finances, and then either drain his accounts or wait for him to die. In the case of husband number 4, a 60-year-old widower named Robert Chen, she convinced him to add her to his life insurance policy 6 months before he conveniently died of a heart attack. Michael staggered backward like he'd been punched. "You're lying. You have to be lying." David held up his phone. "It's all here, Michael. Marriage certificates, divorce records, bank statements the investigator obtained legally. Your wife is a professional. You're not her victim, you're her mark." I felt sick. This woman, this creature who had destroyed my relationship with my son, who had kept me from knowing my grandson, who had treated me like garbage, she was a predator. She had married Michael not because she loved him, but because she saw him as another opportunity. "How much of my money has she taken?" Michael asked, his voice hollow. "Well, that's where it gets interesting," David said. "See, I think she was planning to take her time with you. You're younger than her usual targets, still working, still earning. I think the plan was to slowly drain your accounts over several years, maybe get herself added to your life insurance, wait for the right moment. But then I started sending money, And that accelerated her timeline. He pulled up what looked like bank records on his phone. Every dollar I sent for family expenses went straight into a private account she set up 6 months after marrying you. She's been stockpiling money, Michael. My money and yours. How much? Michael's voice was getting louder now, anger replacing shock. $73,000. That's how much she's diverted from both of us into her private accounts. And that's just what the investigator could track. Sarah finally found her voice. You don't understand, she said desperately. I love Michael. I love him more than any of the others. I wasn't going to hurt him. Bullshit, David said coldly. You don't love anyone but yourself. You saw a successful man with a decent income and a mother who could be easily isolated, and you moved in like a shark. Michael was pacing now, running his hands through his hair repeatedly. Jesus Christ, Sarah. Jesus Christ. How could you do this to me? I didn't do anything to you, Sarah said, her voice getting shrill. I made you happy. I gave you a good life. We have a good marriage. Built on lies, I said quietly. Everything was built on lies. Sarah whirled around to face me, her mask finally slipping completely. You shut up, you miserable old bitch. This is all your fault. If you had just stayed out of our lives, if you had just accepted that you weren't wanted, none of this would have happened. The venom in her voice was shocking, but it was also liberating. Finally, Sarah was showing everyone exactly who she really was. You're right, I said, standing up straighter. If I had stayed away, you could have continued bleeding my son dry while keeping him isolated from anyone who might notice what you were doing. If I had stayed away, you could have taken David's money indefinitely while making sure he never got close enough to ask questions. If I had stayed away, you could have destroyed my family completely instead of just mostly. Michael stopped pacing and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. The profanity was shocking coming from Michael, who rarely swore, but it was also somehow reassuring. It meant he was finally feeling something real, something raw. You let her convince you I was the problem, I continued, my voice getting stronger. You let her isolate you from your own mother because it was easier than standing up to her. You laughed when she called me a pain in the ass. You left me standing in the cold on Christmas Eve because she told you I wasn't worth your time. I know, Michael said, tears starting to flow down his cheeks. I know. And I hate myself for it. But I didn't know she was lying about everything. I didn't know she was stealing from us. I didn't know she had a son she was hiding from me. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, David said, his voice hard. You wanted the perfect wife, the perfect life, and you were willing to sacrifice your mother to get it. Sarah was looking frantically between all of us, clearly trying to figure out if there was any way to regain control of the situation. David, honey, you're my son. You can't seriously be choosing these people over me. I'm your mother. I raised you. David laughed, and it was the cruelest sound I'd ever heard. You raised me. You shipped me off to boarding school when I was 14 so you could focus on husband hunting. You missed my high school graduation because you were busy seducing Robert Chen. You told me my grandmother was dead, so I wouldn't have anyone else to turn to when I needed family. He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're not my mother. You're a con artist who happened to give birth to me, and now everyone knows exactly what you are. Sarah's face crumpled, but I could see in her eyes that she was already calculating her next move. People like her don't give up easily. Michael, she said, reaching for him with a trembling hand. Baby, please, let me explain. Let me make this right. I can change. I can be better. Michael stepped away from her touch like it burned him. How, Sarah? How do you make 20 years of lies right? How do you give me back the relationship with my mother that you destroyed? How do you give David back the grandmother you stole from him? I can't, Sarah whispered. But I can try to make amends. I can return the money. I can help rebuild the relationships. With what money? David asked. The $73,000 you stole is gone, isn't it? Spent on clothes and vacations and maintaining your perfect lifestyle? You don't have anything to return. Sarah's silence was answer enough. Michael walked over to where I was sitting and, to my complete surprise, knelt down in front of my chair. Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, but can you ever forgive me? Can we try to rebuild what I destroyed? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had hurt me so deeply I thought I might never recover. His face was streaked with tears, and I could see genuine remorse there. But I could also see years of pain and betrayal between us. I don't know, I said honestly. I want to forgive you, Michael. I want to have my son back. But I don't know if I can trust you not to choose someone else over me again. What if he didn't have to choose? David asked quietly. What if he didn't have the option? We all looked at him, confused. David pulled out his phone again and showed it to Sarah. I took the liberty of forwarding all the investigators' findings to the FBI Fraud Division. Turns out, what you did to Robert Chen looks a lot like murder for insurance money. And what you've been doing to Michael and me constitutes wire fraud and identity theft. Sarah's face went completely white. You didn't. I did. They should be here any minute, actually. As if on cue, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, I could see two people in dark suits standing on the porch. That would be Special Agents Morrison and Chen, David said, looking at his watch. Right on time. Sarah bolted for the back door, but David was faster. He caught her arm and held her firmly. I don't think so, Mom. You've run away from consequences your whole life. Not today. The knocking at the front door was getting more insistent. Michael walked over slowly and opened it, revealing two FBI agents who looked exactly like what you'd expect FBI agents to look like. Mr. Henderson, I'm Special Agent Morrison. This is Special Agent Chen. We're here to speak with Sarah Henderson regarding an ongoing fraud investigation. Sarah started screaming then, a high-pitched wail about how this was all a misunderstanding, how David was lying, how she was being framed. But the agents had clearly heard it all before. They cuffed her efficiently and read her rights while she continued to protest her innocence. We'll need statements from all of you, Agent Morrison told us as they led Sarah toward the door, but we have enough evidence to hold her for now. As they walked Sarah out of the house, she turned back and looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. This isn't over, you miserable old cunt, she snarled. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. Agent Chen stopped and turned back to her. Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop talking right now. Threatening a witness is a federal crime. They loaded Sarah into their car and drove away, leaving the three of us standing in the sudden silence of Michael's living room. The front door was still hanging open from when David had kicked it, letting in the cold December air. Is it really over? I asked, hardly daring to believe it. David closed the front door gently and turned to face us. For her? Yes. She's going to prison for a long time. The evidence against her is overwhelming. He looked at Michael, then at me. But for us, I think it's just beginning. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of my new apartment, making Sunday dinner for my family. My real family. The one I'd thought I'd lost forever. The apartment was bigger than my old place, with 2 bedrooms and a proper dining room. David had insisted on paying for it, and for once in my life, I'd let someone take care of me. The walls were covered with photos now, pictures of Michael as a child that I'd kept all these years, mixed with new photos of David and the three of us together, slowly building the memories we'd been robbed of. Michael walked in carrying a bottle of wine, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago, and while the legal proceedings had been ugly, they'd also been quick. Sarah's arrest had made it easy for Michael to prove fraud in the marriage, and he'd been able to recover most of his assets. How are the potatoes coming along? He asked, peering over my shoulder at the stove. Almost ready. Where's David? On the phone with his girlfriend. I think he's trying to convince her to move down here from Seattle. I smiled. David's girlfriend Emma was a lovely woman, a nurse who was kind and genuine in a way that made her the complete opposite of Sarah. She'd visited twice in the past few months, and I could see why David was smitten with her. I hope she says yes, I said, stirring the gravy. I'd like to have more family close by. Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? Really happy? Not just saying you are to make me feel better, but actually happy. I set down my spoon and turned to look at my son. The question was harder to answer than it should have been, because happiness felt like such a foreign concept after so many years of loneliness and disappointment. But as I looked around my warm kitchen, smelling the roast in the oven and hearing David's laughter from the next room, I realized that yes, I was happy. For the first time in decades, I was genuinely happy. I am, I said. I really am. Michael nodded, but I could see there was something else he wanted to say. We'd been working on rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully. He was seeing a therapist to deal with his guilt over how he'd treated me, and we were both learning how to trust each other again. I need to tell you something, he said, something I should have told you months ago. My stomach clenched. After everything we'd been through, I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation. What is it? Michael sat down at my little kitchen table and gestured for me to join him. The night Sarah was arrested, after you and David left, I went through her things. I found a box hidden in our bedroom closet, full of papers and documents. He paused, running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since he was a little boy when he was nervous. There were letters in there, Mom. Letters you'd written to me over the years that I never received. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, invitations to things. Sarah had been intercepting them and hiding them from me. I felt my heart stop. What kind of letters? Everything. Letters you wrote when you were sick last year, asking me to call you. Cards for my birthday every year since I moved away. Even a letter you wrote when Dad died, telling me how proud he would have been of me. Tears started flowing down my cheeks. All those years, I'd thought Michael didn't care about the cards I sent, the letters I wrote. I'd thought he was ignoring my attempts to stay connected to him. There was one letter in particular, Michael continued, his own voice shaking now. It was from 3 years ago, right after Sarah and I got married. You wrote about how you understood that I needed to build my own life, but that you hoped there would always be a place for me in it. You said you loved me no matter what, even if we didn't see each other as much as we used to. He reached across the table and took my hands. Mom, I never got that letter. I never got any of them. Sarah told me you'd stopped writing, that you'd said you were moving on from trying to have a relationship with me. She said you thought I was better off without you interfering in my marriage. I couldn't speak. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Sarah hadn't just isolated Michael from me in person. She'd systematically intercepted every attempt I'd made to maintain our connection through the mail. There were other things too, Michael said. Records showing that she'd been telling people at my work that you were unstable, that you'd been calling and harassing us. She'd been poisoning every relationship I had, making sure no one would ever question why I didn't see my mother anymore. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I managed to ask. Because I was ashamed. Because I realized that even if I hadn't known about the letters, I should have tried harder to maintain our relationship. I let her convince me that it was normal for a man to drift away from his mother after marriage. I let her make me believe that choosing her over you was what mature men did. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently finished his phone call. Emma's moving here, he announced, then stopped when he saw our faces. What's wrong? What did I miss? Your grandfather was just telling me about some letters Sarah kept from me, I said, wiping my eyes. David's expression darkened. That bitch. Even from prison, she's still causing pain. David, I said gently, don't let her poison your heart. She's not worth the energy it takes to hate her. How can you be so forgiving? David asked, sitting down at the table with us. She destroyed 25 years of our relationship. She stole decades from us. I thought about that for a moment. She did steal years from us, but she didn't steal our future. We're here now, together, and we have time to build something real. We have time to love each other the way family should. Michael squeezed my hands tighter. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, I said honestly, but I'm not forgiving you for your sake. I'm forgiving you for mine. Because holding on to anger and hurt only gives her more power over our lives, and she's already taken enough. David leaned back in his chair, studying both of us. You know what I realized? Sarah thought she was so smart, manipulating everyone, controlling the narrative, but she made one crucial mistake. What's that? Michael asked. She underestimated the power of love. She thought that if she could just separate us long enough, we'd forget about each other. She didn't understand that real love doesn't just disappear, even when it's buried under lies and manipulation. It waits, and when the truth finally comes out, that love is still there. Maybe even stronger than before. The timer on the oven chose that moment to go off, breaking the emotional tension in the room. I got up to check the roast, grateful for a moment to compose myself. "So Emma's really moving here?" I asked David, changing the subject to something happier. "She got a job at the county hospital. She'll be here next month. And you're okay with that? Leaving Seattle? Starting over here?" David smiled, and I could see Michael's eyes in his face. The same warmth I remembered from when my son was young. "Grandma, I spent 25 years thinking I didn't have extended family. Now I have you and Michael, and soon I'll have Emma here too. This isn't starting over. This is finally starting." As we sat down to dinner a few minutes later, I looked around the table at these two men who had become the center of my world. Michael was telling David about his plans to start his own business now that he was free from Sarah's financial manipulation. David was talking about maybe buying a house nearby, something with a big yard where Emma could have a garden. For dessert, I brought out a chocolate cake I'd made from scratch. And as I was cutting slices, David pulled out his phone. "I want to show you something," he said, scrolling through what looked like old documents. "I've been working with a genealogist to put together a complete family tree. I wanted to know about Dad's family, about your family, about all the connections Sarah tried to erase." He showed us photos of relatives I hadn't seen in decades, people I'd lost touch with over the years as I'd struggled to raise Michael alone and then watched him drift away. Cousins who'd moved across the country, an aunt who'd died 5 years ago but had left behind children who still lived nearby. "I've been in contact with some of them," David said. "They want to meet us. They want to be part of our lives if we're interested." I felt overwhelmed by the possibility of it. For so long, it had just been me, isolated and alone. Then it had been just me and the fantasy of a relationship with Michael that existed more in my mind than in reality. Now, suddenly, there was the possibility of a whole network of family connections, of belonging to something larger than myself. "Are you interested?" Michael asked me. "In reconnecting with the family?" "I think I'd like that," I said. "I think it's time I stopped being afraid of getting hurt and started believing that good things can happen too." As the evening wound down, Michael and David worked together to clean up the kitchen while I sat in my living room, looking through the photo albums David had brought. Pictures of relatives I barely remembered, stories of family history I'd never known. "Mom?" Michael appeared in the doorway, drying his hands on a dish towel. "David and I were talking, and we want to ask you something." "What is it?" "We want to buy a house together, the three of us. Something big enough that we can all have our own space, but where we can be a real family. David's got the down payment covered. I can handle the monthly payments, and you'd never have to worry about rent or utilities or any of that again." I stared at him. "Michael, I can't let you two do that." "Why not?" "Because I'm 70 years old. Because you have your own lives to live. Because you shouldn't have to take care of me." David came into the room and sat down beside me on the couch. "Grandma, do you remember what you told me the first day we met? When I asked if you were okay financially?" I nodded. "You said you got by, that you didn't need much. But you know what I heard? I heard a woman who'd been strong for so long that she'd forgotten it was okay to let other people be strong for her sometimes." "We're not asking you to let us take care of you," Michael added. "We're asking you to let us be a family. Real family. The kind where people take care of each other because they want to, not because they have to." I looked at these two men, my son and my grandson, who had been kept apart by lies but had found their way back to me and to each other. I thought about all the years I'd spent alone, all the nights I'd eaten dinner in silence, all the holidays I'd spent watching other people's families from the outside. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's be a real family." 3 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of our new house, making Sunday dinner again. But this time, Emma was helping me, chatting about her job at the hospital while she chopped vegetables for the salad. David and Michael were out in the backyard, arguing good-naturedly about whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in the garden they were planning. The house was perfect for us. A big old Victorian with lots of character and enough bedrooms for everyone to have privacy, plus a guest room for when Emma's family came to visit, or when we finally reconnected with those long-lost relatives David had found. As I stirred the gravy, I caught a glimpse of myself in the kitchen window reflection. I looked older, of course, but also somehow younger than I had 6 months ago. My shoulders were straighter, my smile came easier, and there was a light in my eyes that had been gone for so long I'd forgotten it was possible. "Clarice?" Emma said, touching my arm gently. "Are you okay? You looked like you were somewhere else for a minute." I smiled at this young woman who would soon be my granddaughter-in-law, who called me by my first name because she said Mrs. Henderson made her feel like she was talking to her grandmother, and she wanted me to feel like a friend. "I was just thinking," I said, "about how different everything is now. Different good or different scary." I looked out the window at Michael and David, who were now both kneeling in the dirt, apparently having decided to plant both tomatoes and peppers. They were laughing about something, and I could see the resemblance between them that had been hidden for so many years. "Different wonderful," I said, for the first time in my life. Different wonderful. That night, after Emma had gone home and David and Michael had both retreated to their respective rooms, I sat on the front porch of our house with a cup of tea, looking up at the stars. The neighborhood was quiet, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the highway, people going about their lives, heading home to their own families. I thought about Sarah, locked away in federal prison, probably still convinced that she was the victim in all of this. I wondered if she would ever understand the damage she'd done, or if she was already planning her next con for when she got out. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all, because people like Sarah thrive on attention, even negative attention, and the best revenge against someone who stole years of your life is to spend the remaining years being genuinely happy. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since my husband died, I wasn't afraid of the future. I had my family back, and they had me, and we were going to make the most of whatever time we had left together. As I finished my tea and got ready to go inside, I heard David's voice through his bedroom window, talking to Emma on the phone. "I love you too," he was saying, "and I can't wait for you to really be part of this family. Grandma's going to teach you how to make her famous pot roast, and Michael's already planning to walk you down the aisle when we get married, since your dad can't be there." I smiled and headed inside. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant Michael would go to work at his new business, David would work from home, and I would spend the day making this house feel more like home. Maybe I'd plant some flowers in the front yard, or finally hang those family photos David had been collecting. Or maybe I'd just sit on the porch again and enjoy the simple pleasure of being surrounded by people who loved me. People who wanted me in their lives not because they needed something from me, but because they couldn't imagine their lives without me. It had taken 70 years, but I was finally home. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.